thank you, Doc Marek, for the introduction and for giving a perspective as to what we will be talking today and what we'll be covering and discussing today. So my talk is focused on how do we build technology solutions during this pandemic, especially how do we ideate and how we execute. Given that it's still ongoing, what are the type of mindset that we need to do? What are the opportunities and gaps that out there that needs our expertise, that needs your help, and identifying what type of solutions relevant to those gaps are immediately needed. So before I formally start my talk, I would want to know a little bit further as to who are my audience and who are the audience attending these talks. I would want you guys to go to menti.com. If you are using your laptops, you can just go to menti.com and use the code 814610. And I'll be just answer a multiple choice question there. Just define what's your profession, so that I would want to understand who are my audience. So probably to give a much more context into the conversation itself. So I'm seeing it for around 174 plus participants today. That's a huge number. So we're seeing more teachers and professors here. All right, so I think we'll probably stop at this point. This already gave me an idea and a clue as to who are my audience are. So majority are teachers and then followed by students. So we have mobile developers also here, web developers, data scientists and AI engineers, IT administrators, and some entrepreneurs who are here attending the event. All right, so I go ahead straight to my presentation. Thank you very much for taking time to answer that. Definitely would give a lot of context to the conversation that we will be having. So as shared by Doc Marek a while ago, so we're relatively not prepared for a pandemic. So everything changed. It literally pushed us to rethink how we work. It also pushed us into understanding what we need to do. Some people would relatively probably stop doing the work or because they have been affected. And to summarize, we're not prepared for a pandemic. Even our company or even some of my friends are not ready. But since that we are already facing this pandemic, what we need to do is to face it, right? So there's no alternate solution that we can actually do, but face it. And we're relatively starting from scratch again. Everything that we know, everything that we were able to understand and learn for the past years slowly became irrelevant, or some of them became irrelevant. And it feels like we're drawing again from scratch, drawing and figuring out what would happen next, how would I evolve the workflows that I have in the organization or workflows that I have in my company. How do I now probably learn new things, completely change everything? So market perspective, business perspective that was released previously or released early this year became irrelevant. because it completely changed the game. And majority of people and organization tried to figure out how will they navigate into the unknown. Unknown, why do I put it in the context of unknown? Is because we don't know when this will end. We don't know what would be the impact of this in the economy. Some of the organization perceive that it would impact, it would relatively cause recession. That would mean it would also impact the way prices that would be on the retail, prices on the stores would definitely impact the economy as a whole. And we're completely off guard. That's why we're given a blank page. And if we're going to look into a blank page, what we need to usually do is to draw again, build again, and learn from the data and learn from the environment that we have. So if we're going to contextualize further, there are three phases in what we are experiencing right now. So we have the pre-pandemic phase in which we are actually doing the way we usually do, the work that we do. It's a normal prior to the pandemic itself. So going probably to meetings or continuously doing commonly tasks or common tasks that you do as part of your job roles and responsibilities. Those are some of the things that are happening during the pre-pandemic. And you can also like go to beach, you can chill, relax if you're stressed out with work or stressed out with school duties. So a lot of those are things that normal during the time. And then we have this space during pandemic, which completely changed the way we work. So it brings a different level of challenge, such as limited mobility, limited resources. How do we also able to do conversations with others, because some of them probably have limited internet connections, and we try to also manage our mental health because every information that we also receive is online. And the way that we usually cope in pre-pandemic is we chill out with our friends. We do other work beside the work task. But during the pandemic, you probably have observed that it became 24/7 in terms of work, right? That even if you're Saturday or Sunday, someone will Viber you or someone will message you that you should do this and you should do that. So the limitations or the boundaries of work became it completely changed. It became different, and we have a different pace now, which is post-pandemic, in which we are relatively aimed for. We would want to get out of this pandemic, and we would want to reach that phase. But right now, we are in this during pandemic phase, in the hopes of a post-pandemic phase happening in the next few months. What are the affected industries when the pandemic hit? So one of the foreseen affected industries that you have probably identified or probably have noticed is transportation, especially airplanes. And then there's a huge hit in the context of the tourism and hospitality industry. Imagine that one of the drivers of our economy is tourism. And based on some reports, this transportation and tourism industry alone would affect at around 30 million jobs in Asia. Imagine how huge job loss is happening in transportation and tourism. It is also expected, or also already impacting our manufacturing prowess. It also impacts retail, trade. It also have impact our micro and small enterprises and real estate. And in the context of the Philippines, it is assumed that it's going to hit at around 5 billion to 1 trillion in terms of peso impact to the economy itself. And a lot of these industries are still trying to figure out how would they innovate. There's no right solution right now. Majority of these companies are still figuring out how will they able to cope up, and how they will be able to pivot their business so that they can still earn or make money and provide to those people who and maintain those people who are doing jobs for these companies. And based on the estimate, we have around 1.8 million estimated job loss in the Philippines. This is based on the data provided by Business World Online, and it would definitely weaken our job market. So imagine this number of people who are losing their jobs because it impacts the industry that I was mentioned a while ago, especially that tourism have been a huge hit. We know that we're hugely relying, or majority of our probably fellows and friends have been relying on tourism to run their business. You have Boracay, you have Coron, so all of those have stopped because of the pandemic itself, right? And this resurfaced a lot of challenges, not only on the perspective of healthcare, but also across industries. It not only resurfaced, but also amplified challenges in those sectors as well. So if we're going to look at what are the challenges, the foreseen challenge or the immediate challenge was the healthcare industry. So during the pandemic, when the start of the quarantine itself, so the healthcare industry is becoming the first initial identification of which are the gaps, what are the challenges, and what are the solutions we can build around those gaps on the healthcare industry. So in the context of testing monitoring, how do we speed up testing? How do we increase capacity of testing? How do we make sure that we monitor potential suspected or probable cases? So there's also some challenges on the early few weeks when the pandemic started. And then it progressed, moving towards speeding up diagnosis and be able to do tracing. So, and after the few weeks, it immediately changed direction as to what are the challenges now. And then it also moved to a different challenge. So you have now be able to provide accurate and timely data. So we need to make sure that in order for decision makers to make the right decision, we need to be able to capture the right data at, if it's possible, if it's a real-time data that we can see and analyze, that would be helpful. And most of all, how do we augment our frontliners? How do we able to help them? Because doctors and nurses are also susceptible into getting the disease itself. So how do we make sure that we're able to also aid our limited resources in healthcare? So these are the foreseen gaps and challenges in the first few weeks of the pandemic in the Philippines. Besides this challenge in the healthcare industry, slowly, some of the companies in different industries have moved into exploring what are the challenges within their industry. So this is across industries. So what are the challenges there? So there's a change in process. There are change also in workflow. People will now doing, I don't know, some of them will be using tools and software to time in and time out. Some of those would be leveraging technologies such as Google Meet, Microsoft Teams, or other productivity tools to help monitor and engage their employees further and be able to also monitor their productivity. So there's a change in process and workflow. So in the context of the pre-pandemic, all of those processes are in place. And it became irrelevant because it changed the way we work. So majority have been figuring out what are the changes that I need to do or set into place. How does technology would enable that? Because it's hard to put people now into one place, right? But there's a way for us to leverage technology to get into conversations such as this, putting in webinars or leveraging other technologies that would allow us to communicate properly. And then there's also change in behavior. This is driven because of the limitations or the limited mobility that people would have. So you can probably see that some restaurants would offer different products now because it's the way for them to still earn, but they still change their business model. And there's also change of consumer behavior. You're now seeing that you cannot go to a physical store to purchase something. So you're now going to move your stores online, and you got to see that some of the big retail stores are also moving all of those initiatives that they have on the physical store online, and you're going to see that continuously. So, and because of limited resources and limited capability and limited business also running, and this results to job loss. Imagine a restaurant or um, a gym store or a gym equipment or or a restaurant wasn't able to was relatively close because they weren't able to handle or has been challenged by the pandemic itself, so which is also to job loss. So these are some of the challenges revolving around different industries, not only on the healthcare industry itself. So it actually progressed into starting immediately first on the healthcare industry. Even corporates and NGOs tried to help bridge or identify the gap into the healthcare industry itself. And now it slowly moves into identifying how will now they support micro and small enterprises, and how will they able to be able to solve some of their challenges. And given those contexts of what are the challenges right now, those challenges will continuously evolve. And we're still in the context of a pandemic, right? So this would continuously evolve. There will still be gaps that needs to be identified, and we need to put into a process on how we do things. So how do we conceptualize technology solutions now? And the process that I will be sharing is a process that we have been doing and what I have been observing on different organizations who have launched softwares, who have launched products in a matter of weeks, in a matter of days. And how do they do it is be able to be quick and be able to prioritize speed and be able to quickly identify gaps in the existing processes. So what I have observed is first, they immediately build on create teams. And after that information, they define what are the problems that they would want to solve. Next, they would literally move into ideation. This is where they figure out which solutions are able to solve the challenges and problems that they would be that they aim to actually identify and tackle. And then once the ideation phase is already completed, they move into implementation. This is where they work with stakeholders and implement the product, and they move into the deployment. So we'll go into each of these steps one by one and dig down deeper. So for a team formation, so what I have observed is there are two big factors or two big points on how team formations started when the pandemic struck. So first, it's volunteer driven. Volunteer driven in a case that some of people posting on social media that they need help, that they need to build this type of solutions, and they quickly organize themselves. So for example, DevCon quickly addressed some of the challenges. So they build a call for volunteers to get talents that would help them build solutions during the pandemic itself. So besides the volunteer-driven approach, so you have the corporate and NGO-driven. So this is where it's driven by some NGOs who would want to help and aid the public sector into figuring out or addressing the needs that they have. And you also have corporate clients who are putting also efforts to aid and bridge the gaps and build solutions to help the public sector, especially in the healthcare sector itself. So there's two different ways how the teams are formed. And sometimes in the corporate NGO perspective, you are looking into corporate partners or corporate doing partnership with other companies to solve a huge task itself. So this is where you got to see the context of bayanihan, that there's no companies who would want to just do it by themselves, but there you see companies who are working together to solve a specific problem and objective. And in the same context also on the volunteer driven, in which you got to see developers, you also got to see doctors who are also working or who are also helping put into the context or put more context as to what solutions they are building. So the volunteer driven is more of like a bottom up approach, because majority doctors would say these are some of the challenges, and then you have some business analysts who would join the volunteer group, or developers who would join the volunteer group to help figure out which solutions or how which solutions it would address their problems. And you have corporate and NGO driven, which is definitely approaching it differently, doing it on a top-down approach, because they have already identified what are the challenges they have seen, because they are the one who is on the implementation and policies and observing what are the gaps already on the healthcare and the public sector space. After this team formation, we move into the define phase. So this is where we try to identify which challenges we would want to solve. So there's a lot of challenges lying in. This could be a challenge on monitoring, be able to perform contact tracing, and be able to, how do you now probably augment workforce of our limited frontliners? So how do you do that? So there's a lot of like challenges. I think I mentioned some of the challenges there. So this is where you're going to pick which challenges you would want to take or you would want to solve, and identifying who are the target beneficiaries. So target beneficiaries, would this be for public users? Would it be used by the public sector themselves to aid them to do better decision making? Are this only for a specific group of stakeholders? So identifying the target beneficiaries are important, because this would help you identify or help you build solution that fits their context. And next is identifying partners. Since we're doing it, or majority of companies are doing this out of their pocket, and volunteers are spending a lot of time out of their work hours to help. So how do we now put in partners to amplify the efforts of these organizations? So one of the efforts that I was able to encounter was the Department of Science and Technology, especially PSHERD, launched immediately a grant, especially to those applications who would want to tackle issues and challenges on the healthcare sector. So they have asked some of us to submit proposals, and they're able to fund some of those projects immediately. So imagine, I know I have been I have experienced like writing proposals for DOST. It would actually take months for you to write papers or write a proposal, right? But in the context of the pandemic, they also like changed their process. How they, I think I was able to like just write a 1 or 2 page proposal for that project, and then they asked also other agencies or other companies and organization, may it be private or public organization, to submit, and they were able to provide funds immediately. So it also changed the process on how they also work. And next important is data gathering. This is where we also look into which data are available and be able to go in depth as to the requirements of the stakeholders or the target beneficiaries in which we're aiming to build the solutions with. So after the define stage, we move into the ideation stage. This is where the teams got to start to brainstorm ideas on how they're going to solve those challenges. So there will be some clever ways of solving it. There will be some novel ways to solve it. And the context in the ideation is, how do we now create something and roll out something fast? So if you put into the context that you need to deliver something fast, it changed the way you think. So if we're working towards in a pandemic situation, if you're building something, there's a context of speed, and speed matters. So when you build solutions now, you need to think of, okay, how do I now build it? Can I roll out something quickly in the next week? And then I can build continuous iteration to improve the service or to improve the product. So there's a lot of things that needs to be considered in the context of ideation. And next, to improve further your ideation process, on the ideation process is, some people would conduct user research and interviews. And this sometimes tends to be tedious, but given that on a team formation itself already, you have already experts joining your team. It makes it easier. It makes the communication faster. So you get context immediately if something that you perceive as a useful feature is really useful or not. And all of those is an iterative process, and all of those actions are completely defined or built holistically by different expertise to come up with a solution that would fit the needs. It doesn't mean that when you ideate the solution, it wouldn't change. So it's just a starting point as to which do you think is relevant given the gaps right now. And majority in the ideation phase, some of the companies and even organization started to identify a gap on the health screening. So health screening is you're going to go to a website or go to a mobile app, and then they will be assessing or asking you questions as to, did you travel for the past 14 days? Are you experiencing the symptoms? And they would derive as to, are you a probable, are you a PUI, are you a PUM, or and then be able to provide that recommendation to you. So those are health screening apps. Since those are the foreseen immediate needs during the first few weeks of the pandemic, a lot of organizations have been doing those apps. So I think there's around 10 plus applications who work on the health screening apps. And because that's the immediate need. So you get to see some localized implementations of that in Iloilo. You got to see localized implementations of that in Zamboanga and other cities. And you got to see an implementation of that that tackles different LGUs. So not only targeted to a specific LGUs, but also would want to organize data on a macro level, trying to build a solution that's not only restricted to a specific LGUs, but can also be used and be useful into different sectors and LGUs. So there's a lot of brainstorming and solutions. So completely, this is also changing as we progress. Challenges also is evolving. Ideation, probably the solutions that you will be thinking will also evolve. So it would start with a simple solution and will grow solution further as we progress through the weeks. So next part is the implementation. So this is where we try to look into the skills and resources needed, or in some of the teams, they will be assigning tasks. Since again, if we put into context, that speed matters. Therefore, you need to have the resources set to help you speed up the development, speed up the opportunity, or speed up the process that you will be doing. Sometimes we do the implementation, or some companies will do the implementation in parallel with talking to the public sector and then already discussing the commercials or doing the contracts with them. Sometimes other organization would already talk to their legal team. What will be the implications of this solution in the context of data? How do we make sure that the data is protected? How do we relay those or put those terms in agreement that patient or potential public users are clearly transparent in terms of how their data will be handled? So a lot of those are executed in parallel, not only just doing the implementation part, but also on the operation part. And on the implementation, identification of the immediate system features, sometimes developers tend to be, they would want to put everything and make sure that everything works before they launch. So identifying what's the minimum viable product. So if I mention minimum viable product, which are the features that is relatively a need instead of like a must instead of just a want. So you need to identify what's a must feature that you need to roll out first. So, and then you're going to put there a context of iterative prototyping. So iterative prototyping means that you need to continuously evolve the product based on how the stakeholders were reacting, how they will actually be using. So a lot of those are happening on a fast-paced environment. So imagine if you're working on a project, you need to put 3 months timeline, but this you're probably going to look at it on a 1 week or a 2 week time frame, and you need to do everything from ideation up until the execution, moving to the deployment of the project itself. And the last part is the deployment. So this is where operational guidelines is very, very important. In the context of the deployment, who will own, for example, the software? If you are a volunteer group, since you're not an entity, right? So there's a lot of challenges lying there. Will you be looking for a partner in which the partner will be the one to front and talk to potential users of this application? So a lot of context would now be placed or set when you work into the deployment. So you'll be probably processing contracts or processing memorandum of agreements with the LGUs or the stakeholders or the beneficiaries that you have identified. And you need to make sure that you are also covered in terms of how do you process your data. So a lot of legal is also important when you roll out solutions. And on the deployment phase, this is where you're going to expect also the product launch. Product launch means that you have, we're able to launch the products and we're able to also look into what are the new opportunities or what are the features that you think the public would be needing. And it's not only just launching the product itself, but also figuring out how do we incrementally improve the product. And initially, that's where you started first with implementation, testing with the stakeholders. Now you're going to test it with actual users. So you need to have a team who would constantly be observing what's happening. Probably there will be some bugs that you were able to see because since you're working with speed, QA process would probably be the quality assurance process would be limited or would impact your time delivery of your product. So you need to test it with actual users, but you need to have a team also looking at what are the things that are that users would probably break. So you need to also solve that as quickly as you can. So just to give a context as to one of the use cases that we have done at Senti is the development of knowledge base for DOH. So we're happy to work together with Google and to work with different organizations and partners to build and help develop Kira. So Kira is the chatbot released by the Department of Health 2 weeks ago. And a lot of organizations are involved there. And on the context of Senti, so we're the one who's working on the development of a knowledge management tool to be able to provide right information and right accurate information needed by the public itself. So how do we conceptualize a solution? So we started first talking with the DOH team, identifying what are the challenges that they have, what are the gaps that they have. Since they are already the one who's doing the work, it's easy to talk to directly stakeholders who can immediately identify the gap. And this is where we help them identify or we propose what solutions fit to help them speed up their process or automate some of their processes. And we know that Google or DOH launched their own Viber group in which they put also a Google Drive in which they place all of their policies, all of their specific guidelines, operational guidelines, and it's kind of tedious for a regular citizen to read all of this, right? So we need to create content that can easily be consumed, can easily resolve challenges or questions by the public. And this is where we have built a knowledge-based system for them to help them speed up the process and make sure that across channels that they have, because they have Viber, they have Messenger, they also have websites, they also have a contact center. So you need to make sure that what information they share is the latest information and what they share is an accurate information. So we need to make sure that DOH is the bearer of truth. So they're the main source of the truth itself. So how we're able to do it? So first is we try to look into their data. We look into their existing processes and how they manage their data. And then we were able to capture that they have been compiling a lot of FAQs, a lot of policy guidelines. I think at the first few weeks of the pandemic, they released their own um, form in which they ask people what are their common questions. So we're able to get those type of data, which enabled us to see what are the common questions and how do we answer those questions, right? And once you actually capture the data, so we're able to extract those documents and try to map questions to responses. And we just started with a small tool first, Google Sheets. So we were not building anything fancy. We're just reusing existing technologies because, again, prioritizing speed and prioritizing the workflow process of DOH, in which they're familiar already with Google Sheets and Google Drive. So we, at the initial launch, is we're just able to leverage the use of Google Sheets to populate questions and what are the responses appropriate for those questions. And through this, we were able to build and leverage existing technologies by Google to help build the knowledge base. So if you're working on the natural language processing field, so we're able to build an intent classifier that just only uses technologies behind Google. So to be able to understand what question is this and be able to map, okay, if this is the question, this is the right answer for that. And be able to also make the machine understand the nuances of the human language, especially that we tend to use Taglish and we use different language in the way we can also converse also is different from one another. So when we first initially launched the knowledge base and integrate it to the chatbots, we see how people are actually asking questions. So they ask a lot of questions. Sometimes they put context before they ask questions. So the way that they conceptualize or ask questions is different from what we expected. So this is why we evolve quickly how we manage those type of challenges or unforeseen challenges prior the initial conceptualization of the product. And since we're building something that is able to be used by different chatbot providers or consumed by different web applications, so we just literally build an API so that people will just easily connect to the knowledge base, throw in questions, and we'll just deliver the right questions or the right responses to them. And right now, we are also building a acknowledgement tool. So we have evolved our initiatives. I think last week, we launched our volunteer portal in which we ask volunteers to help us match questions or unanswered questions from the public or do testing to the knowledge base itself so that it would give the right responses or give the right questions. So if you are keen into helping us or do volunteer work to help improve the knowledge base, just message me. Would be happy to share more information about it. So as what you can see, the way that we work and other companies and other organizations work is they start first leveraging existing softwares before they build solutions or to improve the solutions itself. So it's an incremental way of building software. It's not just, okay, I would want to build this. This is how I can conceptualize it, but this would take 1 month or 2 months to build. So the context there is if we are working on a pandemic, speed is and urgency is what matters. So if existing softwares would definitely solve the problem itself immediately, then use that existing softwares. And then if you get to see emerging gaps as your users use it, then that's a time that you now try to put incremental improvements. So as mentioned, speed matters. So it's very, very important that identification of gaps in different industries and be able to also handle or be able to also identify the urgency. So in a rate of 1 to 5, if 1 is the highest urgent need, so you should be able to capitalize of identifying gap and measuring its urgency. So it's very important because you get to understand what type of actions you would be solving and what type of challenges that you would be working on. So how does organization and team address speed? So you got to see different ways of how organizations, may it be private and public, address speed. So as mentioned, first is they try to increase their resources and they work on in parallel, meaning you have a development workflow, but I'm going to execute, talking to the beneficiaries already, talking to legal department already, or talking to other stakeholders to, help speed up the process. So it's not like a water flow model in which you're just going to wait to build that solution before you're going to do or take actions. So how organization at this speed now is they do work in parallel. So they, if they can actually identify that this workflow is different from this workflow, they execute it in parallel. And some of the organization also, try to, work and organize hackathons. So, I have mentored two hackathons for the past, 2 months. So, and you got to see how different organizations and how different people solve these challenges. So one of the hackathons that I have mentored is the Forkwell Hackathon. It's a hackathon organized by Forkwell, which is a company based in Malaysia. And they created a hackathon for the region, and you get to see, what are the challenges that they have foresee or, that they would want to solve on a regional scale. And you have also Startup Weekend, COVID edition, which was, organized by QBO Philippines, which targets local, ideas and be able to contextualize and conceptualize what are the challenges or gaps in the local scene, and how do we address those gaps. And as observed on this solution, they're not only thinking, addressing solution during the pandemic, but they also would want to address a post-pandemic. So it's a solution that would not only work for a pandemic situation, but would also work in a post-pandemic situation. So you get to also observe how people are also creating solutions, clever solutions that they have been conceptualizing. So you have, I think I noticed that we have teams that they use tricycle drivers or motorcycles to do delivery on a different province. So they would enable, for example, Google Forms to, just process, for example, delivery. So they don't need to build a fancy mobile application to do it. So they just leveraging existing technologies in order to, bridge the gap that is happening in their local space. But besides addressing context in the local space, you still have the perspective of, okay, how do I evolve this solution that I have, thought of into a solution that would also be relevant on a post-pandemic stage. And I think, organization address speed right now is that it pushed majority of companies to, embrace digitization. So you probably have, companies now would be setting up a lot of organizational or productivity tools for their companies. And you get to see how they are also trying to move the way they work online, in the context of teaching, right? So you get to probably record a lot of videos for your students to actually download or for them to view, and which is completely different, concept or context when you're doing it, when you're physically teaching content. So it needs also a different type of skills to actually do that. So, a lot of things that needs to be identified. So if there's, a huge skill gap into the progression from physical teaching to a virtual, teaching. So how do you address those gaps? So probably putting a lot of efforts into training, because people tend to be, mm, they're not, how do I say this? They're not comfortable into teaching online because people are not responding to them. I got to be familiarized with that type of context for the past few months because I was organizing webinar, and you got to also see how do you now, how do people also do their own webinars. So you get to see that there are like they use interactive tools such as Mentimeter to address some of those concerns of interactivity. Some of them would use, for example, the Zoom. You have a Q&A portion there. So a lot of opportunities are there using existing solutions, but you can still improve how things work. So what are the technologies that enable this solution? So as mentioned, since we're prioritizing speed, we would want to leverage on existing softwares, Google Forms, existing APIs available out there, existing software SaaS platform that you would be using, enough to solve challenges that you have as an organization, or build solution that would innovate some of the sectors that you would be working on. Once those are already built, it's expected that you will be doing some of these things manually. That's completely fine. But if you're seeing repetitive processes, that's why you're now going to move to a different technology in which you're going to build mobile or web applications to give a much more robust solution for your target users or target beneficiaries. In the context of COVID per se, if we're building mobile application for COVID, I think there are restrictions when you publish those applications on Google Play Store or on the App Store, because it needs to be under a public sector entity before you can launch all of these COVID-related applications. So those are some of the guidelines that were not there previously, but were set into place to also protect users and protect their data, because if it's a public sector who would be launching the application itself, so there's a lot of data governance and that was already been set to roll out those type of solutions. And you got to also see how emerging technologies are also playing a huge role on enabling the solution to speed up the process. So you have data, and then you have artificial intelligence that complements existing solutions that have already been built to speed up and give much more view as to what data am I seeing, and how do I speed up the process immediately, leveraging machine learning, for example. So some of the solutions that are built on the context of mobile and web, so you have Stay Safe, if you're familiar with that. You have Clear. There's also an initiative on data. I think a group in Ateneo have been working on Faster in collaboration with the UP National Telehealth Center. So a lot of those ideas are being created, and a lot of value have been created to help assist the government and help assist different industries. And in the context of AI, so a lot of projects have been created there also. So you have a team in FEU who's been doing a thermal scanner using drones. You have teams who are actually innovating, trying to use mobile application to detect thermals, to create thermal scans. So a lot of those efforts have been there. So you have the use of natural language processing. I think in one of the hackathons I attended, so they use NLP to identify, for example, what is the prominent candidate drug just by searching COVID-related papers online and identifying what are the number of mentions of this specific drug. And some works would go depth into identifying components and structures of how the drug components would be. I'm not an expert on drug discovery, but there are works on that. I think there's a paper on that already published on Archive, working on those type of scenarios. So there's a lot of evolving work, may it be clever use of technologies or novel approaches as to how they work or build solutions on for this pandemic or during this pandemic. So, but besides these technologies and solutions, there's a lot of ethical considerations that we need to consider. Why we should consider these ethical considerations? We don't want to build something that would also impact the privacy of our users, right? So first is accountability. So accountability is defined if software fails, who would take accountable for that? So for example, if I'm building a machine learning model that predicted something wrong, who should be accountable? So it's very, very important to take into a discussion with the organization that you're working with. If you're building a health screener app, so just as the most common one, if it actually fails into identifying that this potential patient is a COVID patient, who would be accountable for that wrong predictions, right? So there's a lot of conversations into accountability that needs to be taken into consideration. And this would also evolve how you work with your product, right? So for example, in one of the volunteer group that I was able to join and be part of, is when we built our own health screener app, and then it moves to a flow chart that this is a potential or this is a PUI or a PUM, we try to augment it that they need to call a specific hotline to confirm further. So it would affect the way you work, if and you need to take this into considerations. Okay, accountability is very, very important when you build softwares. Okay, especially in the context of a pandemic. Next is transparency. Transparency in the context of what data are you going to capture. You need to define which data are you getting from your users if you are a public facing application, and how do you process this data. So those are very key important factors if you're working with transparency in the softwares, and transparency also with your stakeholders as to what are the capabilities of the technology now, because sometimes you tend to be giving, for example, this can be done, and it's just a matter of time, or it's just a matter of resources, this technology can be done. But if you're working on a pandemic situation in which speed matters, you need to be transparent if this is something that can be done, and what can be done and cannot be done, or can be actually executed or can be created afterwards. So this is where you need to be transparent as to the capabilities of the technology with the stakeholders that you have. And the transparency itself will also enable your users and enable your partners and stakeholders to build trust with the organization itself. Okay. Next is data governance. So data governance, this is where we are looking into how are you making sure that you handle your data properly on your software. So if I'm going to capture data such as names, address, and other public personal identifiable information, how do I store it on my database? Do I just store it? Do I perform some reduction so that if in the case that my data or the data or my software was hacked, they cannot able to see those personal information. So data governance is very, very important, that you need to set place into the organization. And this should also evolve how you conceptualize or how you build your softwares. And lastly, this is where privacy would also be playing a huge role. Compliance with the Data Privacy Act is a must, especially for those applications who are working on data collection. So data privacy, be able to be compliant with that is important. This is why it's a challenge if you are a volunteer group and then you got to roll out your product, because you would be encountering these issues when you deploy your product. So it's very important that you define who will be your partners if you're a volunteer group. If you're starting it as a student project, will your university be able to handle and do those due diligence needed for this product to roll out for you? So a lot of conversations and a lot of considerations are needed before you can actually roll it out. And if we're going to talk about context of healthcare, if we're building healthcare related applications, a lot of conversations and a lot of ethical considerations must be implemented there, especially if you're creating artificial intelligence model or machine learning models that does diagnosis. So you need to be careful about that. You need to make sure that you were able to do testing or do clinical trials first before you roll out something. And it's a challenge also up until now, working with AI related or machine learning related solutions, because you need to also think how would these solutions would impact jobs. Probably you're thinking that this would be helpful, but in an ethical standpoint, yes, it's helpful, but it replaces jobs. So instead of you helping, you were able instead of you helping by building the solutions itself, you were able to like minimize also jobs or when you implemented those solutions. So ethical considerations and this topic must continuously be evolving, and you need to continuously keep these things in your head when you conceptualize, when you build, implement, and deploy your solutions. And these ethical considerations would definitely be useful and will be playing a huge role in establishing governance and structures and continuous policy. We have observed this because I think for when we work with DOH, they will be releasing MOAs or releasing mandates on how this software would be useful. So they try to, as much as possible, organize efforts into one. And this definitely affected how they structure the way they work with software companies, the way they work with organizations, and the way they continuously evolve their policies. And same thing, not only reflecting it on healthcare, this would definitely have an effect on the industry that you would want to work on. And it would definitely change the way your industry would look, the way that your industry would perceive how things are working now, considering all of those ethical consideration that you would be placing into when you deploy or build your softwares. So I'm not quite sure what time are we. I'm speaking a lot. It's already 11. So taking action. So what's the next action that we would want to take? This is not like I scrap out gearing or preparing, because we need to take actions now. It's not it's taking actions now because there's a lot of still gaps out there that needs to be solved by innovators such as you are, and creating new solutions to address those gaps and be able to help our country in a sense in this pandemic. So it's not just only building solutions, but also considering how will this impact lives and how will this impact uplifting economy, not only during this pandemic, but also post-pandemic. So what actions we should take? So very important is that we identify gaps, and there, as mentioned, just to reiterate, first key point is to identify gaps and their urgency. I think there's a lot of gaps in the educational sector. I think it was amplified already. It was amplified during the pandemic itself as to what are the challenges and what are the gaps in the educational sector. There are some also challenges that needs to be addressed in the agricultural sector. So those are some of the things that you can actually look into on a bigger perspective, or probably looking into the context of where you are working now and identifying with what gaps are there. And very, very critical in this space is knowledge sharing, because probably those gaps are similar across all of those industries. So being able to share knowledge and be able to contribute and share experiences would definitely matters. This is where, while I'm pointing out skilled resources, different organization working together, addressing a gap itself. If you're just an organization who would want to build this or address this gap, it would be a challenge. So if you're doing it with other organization, it would have a huge impact per se. And next is be able to utilize first creating clever technologies, using existing softwares, using existing solutions before you move into building novel technology. Yes, you can also build novel technology, but again, if you're prioritizing speed, you might want to start first with something that is already built, or you can have a separate workflow. You have an initiative addressing it differently, and you have a different initiative looking into novel solutions to address these challenges, right? So you can have a different separate workflow for that if you have the capacity and the resources. And as what I mentioned, and continuously would mention is you need to build solution that will not only work during the pandemic, but also will work post-pandemic. So people would always talk about the new normal. Yes, there is a new normal, and that would be driven by technology. That would be driven by innovators such as you, who would be looking into how technology would play a huge role into this pandemic and will continuously play a huge role during pandemic and post-pandemic. And when I also do talks, I want to also emphasize this, that if you were able to create solutions that would create new jobs at the same point in time, that is a very, very good for me solution, because it would definitely help people who we are expecting, who are already experiencing, who are already out of their jobs because of what's happening in the pandemic per se. So yeah, so thank you for your time. Definitely is open for questions. I apologize if I went out of the 45 minutes of simply talking. I hope you guys learned something, and definitely open to questions from the crowd, and would be happy to answer those questions.